Hello everybody, I just wanted to introduce this video because I filmed it in Israel about a month ago and it's still very current, even more so now than before. It is an interview of retired Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, a great a gentleman who understands the relations between the US and Israel, and I just wanted to introduce it because the sound, unfortunately, was not the best. We had an issue with the microphone and we tried to fix it the best we could. So there's a little bit of a noise in the background. You can still make the conversation, and forgive me for the quality of the sound, but you really need to pay attention to what he's saying. And I think his information supersedes the fact that the sound is a little under par right now. So forgive me for the sound. Pay attention to what he's saying. It's important information. And as always, be blessed.
Hello, everybody. This is Olivia Melnick. I've been here in Israel for a few days now, almost a week actually, with Pastor Brendan, and we've been all over the place. We're here just to support the country, to support the people, and to bring any kind of help we can. And in the process, and so we brought supplies to different locations, people in the IDF. We've done some interviews, and today I'm really excited. I get to interview a new friend of mine. I met him back in the States, in Houston, a few months ago. And originally, we were going to do an interview online, and then Pastor Brendan and I were coming to Israel, and we thought, hey, we're going to be in his backyard. So I called him, and here we are. And so I want to introduce to you Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, and I'm going to let him tell you exactly who he is, because he can do it a lot better than me. So Ambassador, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. It's my pleasure and my privilege. Brief background. For 10 years, I was head of a Middle East research unit in the Israeli Civil Service. Later on, I was sent as Israel's Consul General to the southwestern states, based in Houston, Texas, and in charge of the area around Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. That's where I was introduced to small-town America. Later on, I was sent back to Israel as the head of the government press office, which is in charge of Israel's relations with the foreign media. And my last post as a civil servant was in the Israeli embassy in Washington, where I was in charge of Israel's congressional relations. And since 1993, when I retired from the civil service, I decided to pursue that engagement with the U.S. Congress, with American-Israeli relations on my own. And for the last 32 years, I've been to the States 3-4 times a year, spending time on Capitol Hill, off Capitol Hill, in small-town America mostly, but also in the major cities, trying to highlight reality and expose wishful thinking and misrepresentations.
Thank you. That's quite a resume, and I'm sure there's more you could share. Now, let me jump right in. We're 8 months from October 7th, and your expertise is on U.S.-Israel relations. Let's just set the stage. Something happened on October 7th, this terrorist attack. How do you think it's changed everything, not just for Israel, but for the rest of the world, what happened on October 7th?
Well, on October 7th, Israel was targeted by one of the most horrific acts of terror by Hamas terror organization from Gaza. But this is not Israel's war alone. Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the largest Sunni Islamic terror organization, which was established in 1928 with a stated vision, a stated goal to bring the Western infidel to submission and establish a universal Islamic society based on Islam, which according to the Muslim Brotherhood is the only divinely ordained legitimate religion on earth, and all those who do not recognize Islam would be brought to submission by the Muslim Brotherhood. This is our war here today, since October 7. Hamas is also a proxy of the Ayatollahs of Iran. The Ayatollahs of Iran took over control of Iran back in February of 1979, and they have their own so-called constitution, so-called fanatic religious ideology of, first of all, bringing down all what they call apostate regimes, namely non-Shiite Muslim regimes, which means every one of the pro-American Arab regimes, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Oman, etc. And then the goal of the Ayatollahs is to bring to submission the great American Satan. And that's the reason that Iran is not only preoccupied with the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, Iran has been very deeply entrenched in Latin America, from southern Chile all the way to the US-Mexico border since the early 1980s. And when we fight Hamas today, we fight a proxy of Iran. Iran is the number one financial source of support for Hamas, the number one source of military systems, of training, and likewise, by the way, our enemy from the north, Hezbollah terrorists, who are another proxy of Iran, and both Hezbollah and Hamas collaborate with Iran in Latin America, especially when it comes to the cooperation between them and every single drug cartel in Mexico, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Brazil, and anyone who is concerned about the drug trafficking into the U.S., fentanyl and other sources of major deadly threat to America should be aware that Iran plays a key role, and once again, Israel fighting Hamas and Hezbollah is fighting Iran, which considers the U.S. as the number one target. We in Israel are the small Satan. The U.S. is defined by Iran as the great American Satan.
Yeah. So, excuse me. I listen to you, and I've heard some people say like, well, the war between Israel and the Hamas it's a Middle East thing, and it really involves just them. Do you think that, if not the rest of the world, do you think that America should pay attention because the war between Hamas and Israel is probably a bigger existential threat to more people?
Well, in fact, the director of the FBI, Chris Wray, visited Israel during this war in order to study the way Israel is dealing with urban warfare, with terrorism, October 7 style, because according to the FBI director Chris Wray, pro-Iranian Islamic terrorist organizations have been inspired by October 7 to carry out similar acts of terrorism on the soil of the United States. He testified after his visit to Israel in the House and Senate Homeland Security committees, repeating his warning that Iran-supported anti-U.S. Islamic terrorists are already preoccupied with terrorizing the U.S. on its own soil. Recently, in June, he also testified in the Senate and the House Appropriations Subcommittee dealing with domestic homeland security, and he delivered a major address at the West Point Military Academy, reiterating the fact that October 7 is today inspiring anti-American, Iran-supported Islamic organizations. Sadly, while the FBI director recognizes the relevance of October 7th to U.S. Homeland Security, at the same time, Secretary of State Tony Blinken does not recognize the Ayatollahs of Iran as a terror regime. He sticks to his own diplomatic option against towards the Ayatollahs. He's trying to appease them diplomatically and financially, irrespective of the very, very rogue anti-American track record of the Ayatollahs. And here we have within the American administration a major rift, a major conflict of worldviews between the cosmopolitan, multilateral worldview of Secretary Blinken and the worldview of the FBI director, who does recognize the immediate, clear, and present danger of Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah to America's homeland security.
So I'm looking at, I'm listening to you, and by the way, Blinken, I think, is Jewish too, isn't he? So that's, I don't understand. I'm listening to you, and speak on explain, I'm looking at what's happening, and I see a really, really strong case of double standard. The whole world is looking at Israel as the enemy, as the problem in the Middle East. If only Israel would give land, would go for the ceasefire, and by the way, most of the world has forgotten about October 7th. Within a week, they forgot about it, and then they started pushing the agenda of let's make sure that Israel is looked at as the problem. And so I want to talk a little bit about this double standard, and also I want you to help our audience, from your perspective. What do you think the U.S. administration is doing wrong, and maybe even further, why do you think that is? Because I see this as being pure evil. There's no the double standard against Israel, and I just fear that at some point the U.S. might just say, okay, which they almost did a few weeks ago, we're not going to finance any more weapons, and we're not going to help Israel. Could Israel defend herself if that was the case? So that maybe that's 2 or 3 questions right there.
Well, I don't think the issue here is necessarily a double standard or anti-Israel position. The issue is misunderstanding, miscomprehension of the Middle East, and the attempt to apply to the Middle East Western values, Western institutions. Yes. You take the case of the Ayatollahs of Iran, and the earnest attempt by Secretary Blinken to pacify the Ayatollahs. There is a problem. He does not understand, and he takes too lightly, the centrality of a fanatic ideology which is guiding the Ayatollahs. He subscribed to the Western notion of money talks, and he does not accept the fact that when it comes to the Ayatollahs of Iran, when it comes to Hamas, when it comes to Hezbollah, when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian terrorism, they do not allow money or diplomacy to transcend ideology. Because here we have 45 years of the Ayatollahs' regime in Tehran. They have been subjected to a flow of mega billion dollars coming from Western countries, mostly the US, to Tehran, and 45 years track record have documented the fact that such a flow of benevolent gestures by the US to Iran has only exacerbated, bolstered the anti-American, Iranian drug trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, proliferation of military systems, and as I said, all the way to the US-Mexico border. We have seen the misunderstanding of the Middle East many times before. This is not an astonishing development of October 7. You go back to 1981, Israel was pressured brutally by the United States to refrain from bombing the nuclear reactor in Iraq. We were told that if we dare bomb the nuclear reactor, we will be denied supply of combat aircrafts, other military systems, ammunition. We're going to be boycotted by the global community. Well, Israel destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and it took some time for the West to realize that this was one of the greatest gifts by Israel to Western democracies. Only in 1991, after the first Gulf War, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney said in a public event in Washington, "Thank you, Israel, for bombing the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, which spared us, the US, a potential nuclear confrontation in 1991. How many thousands of American lives were saved by such an Israeli defiance of American pressure? How many not billion, trillions of dollars were saved by such an Israeli action? And the same goes for many other such actions. You take the 1967 war, where Israel preempted Egypt and Syria and Jordan in defiance of the US, which sent a message to Israel. If you preempt, you will act alone and you will remain alone. Well, Israel defied the American pressure. The outcome was not only that we were reunited with the cradle of our history, Judea and Samaria, and we reunited Jerusalem, but the action as far as America, the impact of that as far as America is concerned is that we devastated the Egyptian military at a time when Egypt, which was then bosom ally of the Soviet Union, was about to become the pan-Arab leader, attempting to topple every single pro-American Arab oil-producing regime. The devastation of the Egyptian military snatched Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, Bahrain, and others from the jaws of radical Arab pro-Soviet regime. At that time, the US was very much dependent upon the importation of oil from the Persian Gulf. If Israel would not have acted, the ascension of Egypt to the role of pan-Arab leader could have devastated the American economy, America's national security, all of which was spared by Israeli defiance of US pressure. And if you examine series of US pressures on Israel, series of Western world pressure on Israel, you find out that every time Israel defied the pressure, we didn't only serve our existential interest, we also served the interest of the US and the Western world.
Yes, absolutely. Now, so you're talking about this, this difference of cultures when we have the Middle East, the Iran and Hamas, they worship death. And there's no stopping them from that focal point. And then the West values life. I mean, we've seen how Israel, since October 7th, and then way before, not just October 7th, but it's been on the news. It's really right now. It's still happening. How Israel is going out of their way to get 4 hostages back, and all of them if they could, but valuing life. I mean, going back to Gilad Shalit, how many, 1,400 people released for one life?
1,400 terrorists.
Thank you for correcting me, terrorists, for one life. So there's a dichotomy here. How do you deal with people who worship death? How do you stop this?
Well, you have to deal with them realistically and not be guided by wishful thinking. Again, I have no doubt that the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, means well. He really wants to bring upon Israel, the Middle East, the entire world, peace and end to conflict. But the assumption that mega billion-dollar financial and diplomatic bonanza to the Ayatollahs of Iran would induce them to accept peaceful coexistence with their Sunni Muslim Arab neighbors. The assumption or the delusion that such a bonanza, such a gesture towards the Ayatollahs would induce them to abandon their fanatic religious ideology and would induce them to become good faith negotiators is a classic example of wishful thinking, Pollyannish vision, and you cannot base national security on wishful thinking. You cannot base it on hopes that reality will change. We're talking about Middle East where for the last 1,400 years there hasn't been intra-Muslim peaceful coexistence. And here we have a new idea that mega billion-dollar would convince those who haven't managed to establish peaceful coexistence among themselves. Mega billion-dollar would convince them to accord the so-called infidel that which they do not accord to their own so-called believing brothers.
Their own people. Now, and this has been that way, it's not something new, like you just mentioned. This has been that way since the Shah was deposed in 1979. And, and all we're seeing is appeasement. And appeasement didn't work so well for Chamberlain, during the Second World War.
In the Middle East, unlike the West, in the Middle East, gestures, retreats, appeasement are interpreted as weakness.
Weakness, absolutely.
And weakness brings the wolves out. Weakness whets the appetite of terrorists. And any such gesture on the part of the U.S. towards Iranian regime, towards Hamas, towards the Palestinian Authority, towards Hezbollah, is rightly interpreted as a weakening of America's posture of deterrence and therefore a tailwind to rogue regimes against the U.S. and against each one of its allies. In the Middle East, the number one element which protects one's survival is posture of deterrence. Retreat and concessions undermine posture of deterrence in the Middle East. And the pressure by Secretary Blinken on Israel to retreat from Judea and Samaria and allow the establishment of a Palestinian state doesn't only defy history as far as the role played by Judea and Samaria in setting Jewish culture, Jewish history, Jewish religion, Jewish language, it also undermines the ABC of geostrategic policy in the Middle East. Israel's withdrawal from Judea and Samaria would obliterate Israel's posture of deterrence, which would bring in a wave of terrorism which will dwarf October 7. On the other hand, Israel's control of the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria is not only serving Israel, it's the first line of defense of the pro-American Hashemite regime in Jordan, which is bolstered by a strong Israel. And should the Hashemite regime of Jordan be toppled by Islamic terrorism assault on Israel, which would be facilitated by Israeli withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, should the Hashemite regime be toppled, that would create a domino scenario, ripple effect into the Arabian Peninsula, threatening the existence of every single pro-American Arab regime in the area, a bonanza to China and Russia and the Ayatollahs and the Muslim Brotherhood, and a major economic and homeland security setback to the US and every single Western democracy.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, you know, I keep thinking we're here in Israel, but in a few days I go back to America, and you know, there's this current administration that is not doing much or becoming an enemy of Israel. So here's the $1,000,000 question. Where do you think this is going, and do you think things would change if Donald Trump comes back for a second term?
Well, I'm more concerned with worldviews than with personalities. The current worldview guiding U.S. foreign and national security policy is multilateral, cosmopolitan, working with the UN rather than American exceptionalism and America first. In order to maintain the posture of the U.S. has to act independently, not to sacrifice its own interests on the altar of the generally anti-American United Nations. Certainly not to be allowed to be swept by international organizations, most of which are, again, anti-American. U.S. national security policy must, in my mind, highlight independent national security action, whether the Europeans like it or they don't like it, whether the UN likes it or don't like it. The world needs a strong USA, which activates sometimes the military option, not only the diplomatic option. And should there be a change of policy, shifting the U.S. from the cosmopolitan path to the America First path, this will be not only a blessing to the U.S., it will be a blessing to the free world as a whole. The free world needs a deterring U.S. The free world does not need an appeasing U.S. And likewise with the adversaries of the U.S. They are very much beneficiaries of a diplomatic option USA, and they are dreadful of the U.S., which brings back also regime change option in Iran, which brings back the option of a military option hovering above the head of the Ayatollahs. A strong USA deters rogue elements. An appeasing USA only whets their appetite to conduct further terrorism against the U.S. on the soil of the U.S.
We don't have a strong USA right now. The USA the whole world is laughing at America right now because of the current administration, and it's a disgrace.
Well, I would only add that the current policy of appeasement towards Iran's Ayatollahs has driven the pro-American Saudis and the pro-American Egyptians and the pro-American United Arab Emirates closer and closer to the arms of Russia and China. All pro-American Arab regimes are dreadful of the Ayatollahs of Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. And when they see the U.S. Secretary of State appeasing the Ayatollahs and the Muslim Brotherhood, they have no choice but to look for other allies other than the U.S. And that's the reason they recently have acquired more and more Russian and Chinese military systems. They don't do it out of their own choice. They do it because they do not trust a U.S. which appeases the Ayatollahs of Iran and pressures the Saudis and pressure Egypt. Why the pressure? Because the Saudis and the Egyptians are fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the largest Sunni terror organization. The Secretary of State does not recognize the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization. The Secretary of State is convinced that the Muslim Brotherhood is a religious, social, educational, political organization, and once again, shedding light on his detachment from Middle East reality.
Well, Muslim Brotherhood created Hamas.
Absolutely.
So I mean, right there, that tells you. Now, okay, so I know we're doing this interview because of your expertise on Israeli U.S. relations. But if you can speak as we wrap this up, if you can speak on, do you think that the only way to deal with this conflict right now, from the terrorist attack of October 7th, is to continue to eradicate Hamas until they're all gone? And what do you think the situation in Lebanon? Do you think war with Hezbollah is inevitable?
Well, we have on the one hand Secretary of State Blinken pressuring Israel to negotiate with Hamas terrorists. Any attempt to negotiate with Hamas terrorists requires ignoring the track record of the last 15, 70 years of negotiation with Hamas in between waves of terrorism by Hamas against Israel. And the lesson of the last 15, 17 years has been that negotiation with Hamas has bolstered their terror capabilities, leading, in fact, the way to October 7. And the question is, are we going to learn from history by repeating disastrous mistakes, or are we going to refrain from repeating such mistakes? Current U.S. policy pressures Israel to repeat past mistakes. Moreover, current U.S. policy disregards or ignores the most fundamental element of national security. On October 7, Israel's posture of deterrence was demolished. In the Middle East, where there hasn't been yet intra-Arab or intra-Muslim peaceful coexistence, in the Middle East, where regimes do not ascend to power through ballot, but through the bullet, and therefore regimes are tenuous, and as a result, their policies and agreements are tenuous. In such a region of unpredictability, violent intolerance, the most important component of national security for Israel to restore its posture of deterrence, we have to send a message by obliterating the source of terrorism of October 7, namely to obliterate Hamas militarily and politically in the area of Gaza. Should we fail to obliterate Hamas, it will be also failure to restore posture of deterrence, which would not only encourage further wars and terrorism, it will also deter further expansion of the peace process between us and Israel. It will also deter evacuees in Israel from the south and the north to go back to their towns along Gaza and along Lebanon. And it will certainly deprive the U.S. of a major force multiplier in the Middle East, namely deterring Israel.
So okay, fast forward to the day where Hamas is completely gone. Israel has destroyed Hamas, the leadership, the people, clear slate. what happens in Gaza Strip? Do we now have a presence of Israeli forces forever, or do you give back the Gaza Strip and say, okay, start fresh without Hamas? What do you think?
Every decision towards the future must rely on past track record. The track record shows us that foreign, non-Israeli presence in critical areas such as Gaza, Judea, Samaria, or Lebanon not only does not ensure stability and security, but it encourages further acts of violence. For instance, Israel withdrew from Gaza completely by 2005 when we uprooted Jewish communities. We uprooted the Israeli military presence from Gaza. European observers were sent to the area, and within few months they packed and left because they were deterred by the presence of Hamas terrorism. In the north, Israel took over control of southern Lebanon, and we were coaxed into evacuating southern Lebanon in return for a UN resolution 1701, which promised Israel security to be reinforced by presence of international peacekeepers. Within few months, Hezbollah terrorists took over the area. The peacekeepers are busy protecting their own lives. They're not going to sacrifice their own lives on the altar of Israel's national security. Hence, the war in the north. Israel is not the only example that proves that foreign military forces do not bring in more stability. The U.S. Sent its own Marines forces to Lebanon when Israel was fighting Palestinian terrorism in Lebanon. And in fact, the intent of the U.S. military presence was to protect the Palestinians and very hug the Israelis. But then came two car bombs, one Islamic car bomb in the U.S. Embassy and one Islamic car bomb at the U.S. headquarters of Marines. Some 300 or 250 Americans were murdered in those two car bombs, acts of terrorism, and the Americans packed and left Lebanon. America wanted to stabilize Somalia, and they sent American troops to Somalia. But then came the Black Hawk going down. American troops were killed, were lynched, were slaughtered, and the American force packed and left back to America. There are no free lunches in the Middle East. For Israel to secure its own national security from Gaza, we will have to be in charge of security in Gaza. We should not delegate the responsibility to other forces. We have made it very clear. We don't want American soldiers protecting us. We ask for American military assistance, which our soldiers, will use. For Israel to depart from that and allow Americans, NATO, Arabs, international, whatever forces to protect itself from Gaza or Judea, Samaria, or Lebanon is going to injure severely not only our favorability in our image, it will injure severely national security of Israel and therefore the stability of the region and therefore vital American interest in the Middle East.
I agree. So, Ambassador, from a human perspective, it looks like there is very little hope. But I'm always drawn back to God's word, and I read in the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 35 through 37, "Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day and the statutes for the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If these statutes are removed from before me, declares the Lord, then the seed of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundation of the earth searched out below, then I will also reject all the seed of Israel for all they have done, declares the Lord. So I'm looking at this promise from God given to us through the prophet Jeremiah that regardless of how bleak it looks and how desperate it looks in Israel, God has promised in his word, and not just in Jeremiah, in all the prophets, and starting in Genesis, with the promise he made through Abraham in chapter 12, he has promised that he would never forsake Israel. And it breaks my heart, it breaks our heart to see how the whole world is going after the victim, Israel, and being blinded by political correctness, by policies that you've explained to us very well. It breaks my heart, but as far as we are concerned, there are believers in the U.S. and some parts of the world, but we represent the U.S. here. There are believers who really, truly understand God's word, truly understand the place of Israel in the plan of God, and we are going to do all we can to support Israel, to support the people, and to continue representing the truth about Israel, the truth about the Bible, and that's our goal. The truth has to come out because the West is not getting at all the truth about what's going on. So I just want to thank you for your help.
Thank you.
Until next time, God bless you.
Thank you.